What does the death of the greatest empire in history look like? Not a grand ceremony, not a final speech. Just a cold morning, on an empty steppe. 1388. A pale dawn slowly spreads across the frozen plains surrounding Buer Lake. The wind moves through the tall grass. And across the vast open land, 50,000 Mongol warriors stand in silence. No shouting, no war drums. Only the quiet sound of horses breathing in the freezing air. These men are not ordinary soldiers. They are the descendants of the riders who once terrified the world. The heirs of the empire created by Genghis Khan. Their ancestors once rode across continents like a storm. Cities burned. Kingdoms collapsed. Armies vanished beneath the thunder of Mongol hooves. From the Pacific Ocean to the edges of Eastern Europe, their empire stretched farther than any the world had ever seen. For more than a century, the Mongols had been unstoppable. But this morning feels different. The warriors standing on the frozen steppe can sense it. Something has changed. Because today, they are not riding out to conquer new lands. They are not fighting to expand an empire. They are fighting for something far more desperate. They are fighting to stop their empire from disappearing. And before this day ends, the fate of the Mongol world may be decided here, on the cold shores of Buer Lake. If you enjoy cinematic history stories like this, subscribe to the channel. Because in the next part, we'll go back in time to uncover how the most powerful empire in history slowly began to fall apart. Long before this final morning ever arrived, a century earlier. Long before the warriors gathered at Buer Lake. Long before the Mongol Empire began to fade. One man had already changed the course of human history. His name was Genghis Khan. He was born on the harsh steppe of Mongolia, a land of endless grass, violent winters, and constant war between rival tribes. Life on the steppe was brutal. Survival depended on strength, loyalty, and the ability to fight. For generations, the Mongol tribes had been divided. They raided each other, betrayed each other, and lived in an endless cycle of revenge. Genghis Khan saw something different. He believed the tribes could become something greater if they stopped fighting each other. Through alliances, warfare, and relentless determination, he began to unite them one by one. Rival chiefs were defeated. Old loyalties were broken. New ones were forged through loyalty to a single leader. Slowly, the scattered tribes of the steppe transformed into a single force. For the first time in history, the Mongols were united. But unity alone did not create an empire. Genghis Khan reshaped the Mongol way of war. He organized his army with strict discipline. Warriors were promoted for skill and loyalty, not noble birth. Commanders were expected to think, adapt, and move faster than any enemy could imagine. Every soldier was a master horseman. Every warrior could fire arrows while riding at full speed. Speed became their greatest weapon. A Mongol army could travel incredible distances in days, appearing where no enemy expected them. And when the storm arrived, it was unstoppable. The first campaigns swept across northern China. Cities that had stood for centuries fell before the Mongol armies. Fortresses collapsed. Kingdoms were forced to surrender. Then the Mongol riders pushed west, across deserts and mountains, across the great cities of Central Asia, across lands that had never before seen the warriors of the steppe. Every victory made the empire larger. Every campaign pushed its borders farther. Within only a few decades, the Mongol Empire stretched across Eurasia, from the Pacific Ocean in the east to the edges of Eastern Europe in the west. It became the largest continuous land empire the world had ever seen. To the people who lived under its shadow, the Mongols seemed unstoppable. But even at the height of its power, something fragile existed beneath the surface. The empire had been built by one extraordinary leader, one vision, one authority. And empires built around a single man often face the same question. What happens after he is gone? From the very beginning, the future of the Mongol Empire carried an invisible weakness. The seed of its eventual collapse had already been planted. After the death of Genghis Khan, the greatest empire the world had ever seen faced a problem that no army could solve. The empire was too large for one ruler to control. Following the traditions of the steppe, the vast territories were divided among the sons and descendants of Genghis Khan. From this division, 4 powerful khanates emerged. The Golden Horde ruled the western lands across the great Eurasian plains. The Ilkhanate controlled Persia and the rich territories of the Middle East. The Chagatai Khanate governed the heart of Central Asia. And in the east, the Yuan dynasty ruled over China. At first, this arrangement seemed to work. The rulers of these lands were all members of the same family. They were descendants of the same conqueror. They shared the same heritage of the steppe. For a time, they continued to respect the authority of the great Khan. Messages and envoys traveled across the empire. Trade routes remained open. The legacy of conquest still connected these distant regions. But distance slowly changed everything. Each khanate began to develop its own interests, local politics, new alliances, and regional power struggles began to shape their decisions. The rulers were no longer only Mongol princes. They had become kings of their own domains. As years passed, the sense of unity that had once held the empire together began to fade. Family ties grew weaker. Rival ambitions grew stronger. Disagreements over power, territory, and influence began to appear. Small conflicts turned into open hostility. Armies that once fought together now faced each other across battlefields. The descendants of Genghis Khan were no longer united conquerors. They had become competitors. In the west, the Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate clashed for influence over the lands between them. In Central Asia, the Chagatai rulers struggled to maintain control over their restless territories. Each khanate focused more on protecting its own power than preserving the unity of the empire. Slowly, the connections that once linked these vast lands began to weaken. The Mongol Empire had once moved like a single, unstoppable force. Now it was breaking into separate worlds. The unity that had made the Mongols invincible was disappearing. And with every passing generation, the empire built by Genghis Khan was slowly turning against itself. The greatest empire in history was not collapsing because of a powerful enemy. It was collapsing because the bonds that created it were falling apart. The Mongol world was beginning to fracture. While the Mongol world was slowly breaking into rival khanates, one part of the empire remained the richest and most powerful: China. When Kublai Khan completed the conquest of China in the 13th century, he established a new ruling dynasty, the Yuan dynasty. For the Mongols, it was a triumph beyond imagination. They had not only conquered the steppe and the deserts, they had taken control of one of the most advanced civilizations on Earth. But for the people of China, the conquest meant something very different. For the first time in their long history, the land was ruled by a foreign power from the northern steppe. Under the Yuan dynasty, society was reorganized into strict social layers. At the top stood the Mongols. They held the highest military authority, the most powerful political offices, and the greatest privileges in the empire. Below them were foreigners from Central Asia and the western regions who had supported Mongol rule. Merchants, administrators, and soldiers from distant lands were often trusted more than the local population. And at the bottom were the Han Chinese. The people who made up the overwhelming majority of the population were placed at the lowest level of the system. Their power was limited. Their influence was restricted. Many government positions were closed to them. Weapons were forbidden. Military authority remained firmly in Mongol hands. To the rulers of the Yuan dynasty, these measures were meant to maintain control over a vast and unfamiliar land. But to the Chinese population, the system felt like humiliation. Generations grew up under foreign rule. Taxes were heavy. Corruption spread through the administration. Natural disasters and floods worsened the suffering of ordinary people. Across villages and cities, a quiet anger slowly grew. It did not explode immediately. Years passed, then decades. But resentment does not disappear when it is ignored. It waits. It gathers strength. By the 14th century, the Yuan government was weakening. Political struggles within the court made leadership unstable. Local officials lost control over distant regions. Bandits and secret societies began to appear in the countryside. Small uprisings started to break out across the land. What had once been isolated unrest began to spread. The anger that had been building for nearly a century was reaching its limit. And when that pressure finally broke, the explosion would shake the foundations of Mongol rule in China. The land that had once been conquered by the Mongols was preparing to rise against them. When the anger of the Chinese people finally began to erupt, it did not begin with emperors or great generals. It began with ordinary people, farmers who had lost their land, villagers struggling under heavy taxes, families devastated by famine and floods. Across the countryside, rebel groups started to rise. Among them was a movement known as the Red Turban Rebellion. Within this growing chaos, one unlikely figure appeared. His name was Zhu Yuanzhang. His life began in extreme poverty. He was born into a poor farming family. When famine struck the region, his family could not survive. One by one, they died from hunger and disease. Zhu Yuanzhang was left alone, an orphan with no land, no power, and no future. To survive, he entered a Buddhist monastery, but even the monastery could not escape the famine. Food ran out. The monks were forced to scatter. Zhu Yuanzhang became a wandering beggar. For years, he traveled across a broken land, witnessing suffering everywhere. Villages destroyed by hunger, people driven to desperation. Eventually, he joined the growing rebellion against the Yuan dynasty. At first, he was simply another soldier among thousands. But Zhu Yuanzhang possessed something rare: discipline, intelligence, patience. He listened carefully. He studied the strengths and weaknesses of his enemies. He learned how armies moved, how cities could be taken, how power could be built step by step. Slowly, he rose through the ranks of the rebel forces. Followers gathered around him. Commanders trusted him. Armies began to fight under his leadership. What began as a desperate uprising was becoming something more organized, something more dangerous. In the year 1368, his forces marched toward the Yuan capital. The Mongol court could no longer defend the city. The rulers of the Yuan dynasty fled north, abandoning the heart of China. For the first time in a century, Mongol rule over China collapsed. Zhu Yuanzhang declared the birth of a new dynasty, the Ming dynasty. The Mongols were driven back toward the northern steppe. But the story of their empire was not yet finished. The fall had come quickly, but the consequences unfolded slowly. After the collapse of their rule over China, the descendants of Genghis Khan were forced to retreat north, back to the endless grasslands that had once forged their ancestors into conquerors. Yet the steppe they returned to was not the same, and neither were they. For generations, they had lived behind the walls of palaces, surrounded by silk robes, golden ornaments, and endless banquets. Their childhoods were filled with tutors, court politics, and ceremonies rather than the brutal training of survival on the open plains. The Mongol princes who once ruled the richest empire on earth had grown accustomed to comfort. Their hands were softer, their instincts duller. The wind of the steppe did not care about royal blood. Winter storms returned with the same unforgiving force that had shaped the warriors of the past. Food was scarce. Rival tribes watched closely, waiting for signs of weakness. Leadership that once came naturally to the sons of the steppe now had to be relearned. Some tried to revive the old ways. They rode farther, hunted harder, and attempted to rebuild the discipline that had once made Mongol armies unstoppable. But time had changed them. Years inside the empire had reshaped their habits, their expectations, and even their identity. Many no longer thought like the relentless riders who had once thundered across Eurasia. The empire that had lifted them to unimaginable heights had also softened the edge that made their ancestors feared across the world. It was a quiet transformation, almost invisible at first. Yet its effects would echo across the steppe for generations. Because while the descendants of Genghis Khan struggled to reclaim the spirit of their forefathers, a new power was slowly rising beyond the northern forests. And this new force would soon test whether the Mongol legacy could still survive. The struggle to reclaim the strength of their ancestors had become a burning ambition among the Mongol leaders of the steppe. Pride still lived in their blood. The memory of an empire that once ruled China refused to fade. Among those who believed the Mongols could rise again was the great Khan, Toghus Temür. In the year 1388, he made a bold decision. He would march south. He would take back what had been lost. Across the grasslands, messengers rode in every direction. Tribal leaders were summoned. Warriors gathered beneath the banners of the great Khan. Horses were prepared. Armor was repaired. Old dreams returned to life. Soon an army began to take shape. 50,000 Mongol warriors answered the call. To many of them, this campaign felt like destiny. Their grandfathers had ruled China. Their ancestors had shattered kingdoms across continents. The Ming dynasty was young, and in the eyes of the Mongol commanders, it still seemed fragile. If they struck hard and fast, perhaps history could turn back. The army rode south with confidence. Dust rose across the plains as thousands of horses thundered toward the Ming frontier. Scouts reported movement ahead. Ming forces were present, but they appeared uncertain and disorganized. For the Mongol commanders, the signs were encouraging. The Ming troops began to fall back. Village after village was abandoned. Defensive lines seemed weak. Patrols disappeared into the distance. Every step forward felt easier than the last. The Mongol army pushed deeper. Some officers grew cautious. They had seen wars before. Victories that came too easily often carried hidden dangers. But confidence spread quickly through the ranks. The Ming army continued to retreat. To the Mongols, it looked like fear. To the Ming commanders, it was patience. Because the retreat had been planned from the beginning. Behind the low hills ahead, hidden from the advancing riders, another force was waiting. General Lan Yu had prepared carefully. While the Mongols chased the retreating soldiers, the real strength of the Ming army remained concealed. Supply routes were cut. Scouts were misled. The battlefield was being shaped long before the first clash of steel. Then the moment arrived. As the Mongol army rode forward across the open ground, the quiet hills around them suddenly came alive. From behind the ridges and valleys, banners appeared. Armor flashed in the sunlight. 80,000 Ming soldiers surged forward from their hidden positions. The trap had closed. What had seemed like an easy advance into enemy territory was about to become one of the most dangerous moments the Mongols had faced since losing China. And in the chaos that followed, The fate of the great Khan himself would soon hang by a thread. The moment the Ming army revealed itself, the battlefield changed completely. The Mongol riders, who had advanced with confidence, now found themselves surrounded by a storm of steel. Dust filled the air as thousands of Ming soldiers rushed down from the hills, their formation tight and disciplined. The ground that had seemed open and safe only moments before suddenly became a trap with no clear escape. Orders were shouted across the Mongol lines. Commanders tried to regroup their warriors, but confusion spread quickly. Horses collided, units were separated, signals were lost in the noise of battle. The Ming army pressed forward without hesitation. Their numbers were overwhelming, and their strategy had worked exactly as planned. The Mongol forces, stretched deep inside enemy territory, could not form the swift and coordinated charges that had once made their ancestors unstoppable. Instead of attacking as one powerful wave, the riders were forced to fight in scattered groups. The battle quickly turned into a desperate struggle for survival. Across the field, warriors clashed in brutal, close combat. Arrows darkened the sky. The thunder of hooves mixed with the cries of wounded men and horses. For many Mongol fighters, the realization came too late. This was not the beginning of a new conquest. It was the collapse of a final attempt to reclaim a lost empire. When the fighting finally ended, the dream of returning to rule China had been shattered once again. The steppe would remain their home, but the age when the descendants of Genghis Khan could dominate the Middle Kingdom was fading into history. The story of the Mongols did not end here, but the world they once ruled would never return. If you enjoy deep historical stories like this, remember to subscribe to the channel and join us for more journeys into the forgotten turning points of history.